This is Duke University.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to get started and introduce or welcome you to the Karsh Conversations UI UX Tell Me More event today. So I am Christina Plant. I am a career advisor in the Duke Career Center, and I lead the Innovation Entrepreneurship and Design career community. And the Tell Me More career series is meant to help students learn about various career avenues, build contacts in their field, and discover valuable resources and opportunities for career development. And our guest today is going to speak with us about his experience at Capital One and the difference between design roles and insider tips on what skills and experiences helped him prepare for work in this space. And I also wanted to introduce to you our career ambassador, Ellen, who agreed to lead the discussion. Thank you, Ellen. So our career ambassadors provide guidance and advice to students on many topics, including document development, major exploration, job and internship search, lots of things. We are so grateful for our career ambassadors. And then for today's discussion, we're going to start off with some prepared questions, and we'll have opportunities for you to ask some questions throughout. And yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to Ellen. She can introduce herself and we can get started with the discussion.
Oh, I also need to introduce myself.
I can
Hi everyone, my name is Ellen and I'm a junior. I am a career ambassador at the Duke Career Center, and they recruit every semester. So if you're interested, feel free to apply. And now we're welcoming, just started. Can you start by giving us a quick introduction?
Yeah. So hey everybody, I'm Vignesh. I graduated from Duke University in 2020. So not that long ago, still pretty early in my career, but I studied computer science and visual media studies and did an interdepartmental major between the two when I was here. Also did a certificate in innovation entrepreneurship. And yeah, so I'm actually originally from North Carolina. I live in DC right now, work at Capital One. That's where I've been since I graduated. So it's been about 3.5 years now. And fun facts about me, I love hip hop music. I love Drake and J. Cole. I'm into running, training for my first marathon. We'll see how that goes. Also love to travel. So went to Japan this year, coolest place I've been to so far. Yeah, nice to meet everyone.
Yeah, that's really cool. Very diverse experience. So now can you tell us about your time at Duke? Like what type of career path were you considering and how did you land on UX UI design?
Yeah, so for me, I started out by studying computer science, just computer science. And I thought maybe the thing I wanted to do was software engineering because I was really interested in technology and I loved creating. But then I took a few classes and I kind of realized that coding was not the thing that would get me up in the morning. It could be the thing that I would do for a living for the rest of my life. And I was exploring some different paths, like product management is very closely related in some ways. But I heard about design after joining a few clubs on campus, like Hack Duke and Catalyst, which is a technology club. I don't know if it's maybe still, okay, it looks like it's still a thing. But I had never heard about UI or UX design until I joined these clubs and talked to some students who were pursuing that path. And then when I heard that was an option, I did a few internships. So I did my first internship at this local digital agency called Viget, actually. Sounds a lot like my name. I didn't start the company. It's just like a weird coincidence, but really great experience. And it kind of solidified for me that this was a good career path. And it gave me my first chance at trying design in a controlled environment. So after doing that internship, I also, as a sophomore, was like struggling to figure out what do I want to major in. And I heard about the interdepartmental major. And I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but it gives you the freedom to kind of marry two different disciplines and create your own major. And so for me, I took computer science and visual and media studies, which is in some ways the closest thing we have to a design department, and chose classes that felt related to that career path. And there's a couple really good classes I would recommend if you are interested in that route, like digital imaging and graphic design and multimedia was a really great course. They're not going to be like about UI, UX design exactly, but they teach you some hard skills like using Illustrator and Photoshop, or some really good fundamentals like design critique and just thinking of balance, visual balance, or typography, and just being exposed to a bunch of things I'd never heard about before taking these courses. So really it was just by doing. And I think one thing I would mention, just because I think it's interesting. I did a Duke Engage program my freshman year summer instead of doing an internship. And when I was doing that, I kind of had this doubt about whether I was doing the right thing. Because there's this pipeline of like, if you don't do your first internship, you're missing out, you're wasting your time, you're not as prepared as you could be for your sophomore year. My Duke Engage experience was in Kerala in India, and it was focused on these health and education projects. And that kind of taught me that it really reinforced that I couldn't just be at a computer all day coding, and I love to work in some capacity towards helping people solve problems. And that's how I think of design, as like solving problems for an end person, and you do research and you talk with people. And that for me was a good experience to show me what I do and don't like in terms of soft skills. So it's like a combination of things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing about the exploration. And now moving on, what activities or experiences help you prepare for the role in the space?
Yeah, so I talked about a couple of these. I think practically the best way to learn is through internships, because we don't have a design department. If this is something you end up pursuing, the best thing you can do is try to work at a smaller company, or any company really that feels like they have a good design backing or culture, and learn from people and get mentorship in that way. So for me, I did my first internship at Viget, which was a good first step in. And it was an internship, so I wasn't working directly on the actual products that they build for their clients. But it was very interesting also seeing how an agency works, which is very different from a large company like Capital One, where you're working on products in-house for those customers. Whereas as an agency, you have so many clients and they're asking you to build different things like websites or apps. And it was good exposure to that world. And then the next year, my junior year, I interned at IBM on their blockchain platform team. And that was a really good experience in the opposite direction, working at a massive company and giant scale enterprise products. So their customers are other businesses often, rather than just like an end customer like us, an individual. So I'd say the best way to learn is that way. And then if you can find classes on campus, like the two I recommended, I would tap into those just to learn some of those hard skills. And nowadays, I don't know how many of you are seriously considering design or have toyed around with things. I'd be curious to hear, but Figma, of course, is like the big software you should be learning. You may not learn that in a class, but a lot of these fundamentals would translate to Figma. And then the third thing I would mention are clubs. So I did mention Hack Duke and Catalyst. Catalyst was helpful because it just introduced me to people who actually were doing these careers. So I could learn from them. They'd talk with me. I'd have lunches with them and they'd give me advice about recruiting. And then Hack Duke was interesting because it wasn't necessarily UI UX design, but I joined the team as on their marketing and design team. So it was my first time using Illustrator, and the most practical way to actually learn how to make vector-based images and those kind of things. So it was really good practical experience to learn about making graphics for an event and just getting comfortable in that environment. So there may not be like the perfect UI UX design thing, but there are a lot of opportunities on campus for sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you also did the IME program, a certificate program. Mm-hmm. So like, how do you think the IME certificate program helped you in your career path? Yeah,
so I would say there are a few different ways. I don't know, are any of you guys in the IME program right now? Kind of. Okay. So there are a few ways, I think. In some ways, I really enjoyed the Keystone. If you take this certificate, I don't know how much it's changed, but there's 4 courses you would take. 2 of them would be the keystone and the capstone, and I really enjoyed those classes. And there's a couple of things I still remember from them that influence how I think about design today. One of them is this framework called jobs to be done. I don't know if this sounds familiar to anyone here, but businesses, a lot of them still, but it's kind of changed the way they think about design, but they used to just think about making their products better rather than focusing on a customer's needs. One of my IME classes, I remember the professor talked about jobs to be done. And it's a framework that kind of just keeps asking why. So if you were a company making a hammer and you knew your customers just wanted to put a nail in the wall, you could call it a day and just keep making better hammers. Or you could ask that customer, why do they want a nail in the wall? And then if you ask them, maybe they say, I want to hang a picture on the wall. And then you'd ask them why, and then say maybe just to like have some memories of my family, have these mementos to look at. And then maybe what you're building is not a hammer and it's a command strip that just makes it much easier for you to put up pictures and frames and take it off. And that kind of shifts your perspective. And that's what jobs to be done is about in a sense. And then there are little things. Like I remember in one class, one of my professors was asking us about, or he kind of just explained to us, maybe this won't sound profound, but to me, it changed the way about how I think about a lot of things. But everything around us was intentionally designed by someone at some point. There was a lot of thought that went into those chairs or this mic, anything. And one class, we kind of just could choose anything to research and see why it was made that way. And I found out that brass doorknobs are made that way, not just because brass is durable, but apparently it has antibacterial properties. So it's just much cleaner to have brass doorknobs. And that stuck with me too. So I think there's just like a level of thinking about customers and intentional design that stuck with me from that program that directly apply to what I do. But I also just really enjoyed the certificate. There are things that aren't directly related to what I do. And for me, I didn't study economics or business, but there are classes that teach you some very common terms and practices like modeling free cash flow or like COGS as an acronym. Didn't know what that meant until I took a class, right? Like cost of goods and services. And I think it helps to have that language, because even if you don't end up doing that thing, you can speak with your partners, people you work with that do those functions and have a sense of what they're working on, especially if you go to startup, something like that too. So in all of those ways, I think it helped.
Yeah, that's a lot of useful information. And you mentioned that why you go to that role, but like practically, how did you land your full-time role at Capital One? Like, how do you know the rotational development program was right for you, or just like any other aspect?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I was graduating, I was looking for a job that would also kind of take me out of North Carolina. Just wanted to try something new, right? And I was looking far and wide, and I knew a few alums who were working at Capital One, and they spoke really highly about the company. And a couple of them were doing the design development program, which is the program that I kind of graduated out of. But Capital One has various entry-level programs that are rotational. And I really liked that fact that it would let me try, at the second year, you would rotate to a new team. So just by the structure of the program, you get the chance to work on different types of projects, which I really liked, and different types of design. So one role might be more focused on strategy, which is less in the hard skills and more about crafting a story and a customer journey and bringing along your partners. Or another role might be more focused on working closely with tech and product partners and delivering a feature. So that really drew me to the program, because I think it's rare, and oftentimes you could start your first job and just stay with that team for a while. So yeah, and then after speaking with a few of my friends who are working there, I applied, and yeah, the rest is history.
Yeah, that's really cool. And now our last question for the first part is, can you tell us about your current role at Capital One? You mentioned a like, can you explain more? And how would you describe the difference between UX, UI, UX research and product development, especially for like beginners or outsiders?
Okay, yeah. So to the first part of the question, the team that I work on now is more focused on customer growth experiences. What that means though, practically, is I'm working around offers that we show customers to help them get new credit cards, upgrade to new cards, make referrals for new customers, increase their credit line, all of these things that help them manage their finance and maybe elevate their credit level. So that's the space that I work in. And currently I work very closely on referrals and that end-to-end customer experience. And the second part of the question, what are the differences between all of these buzzwords? I'm curious, do you all have a sense? Do you feel like you have a sense between UI and UX and what the differences are? Maybe like a hands up if you do. I won't call it, it's fine. Yeah, it's interesting because when you start applying and if you're interested in this field, you'll see a bunch of these seemingly interchangeable terms. And a lot of roles will have different titles that mean the same thing. Actually, maybe I can switch the slides real quick because that might help. Our clicker is cool. Let's see if that's working. Okay. I'm gonna skip past this real quick and just talk about like different parts of design.
Awesome PowerPoint, man.
Thank you. Thank you. So when I think about UI and UX, I think the easiest way to talk about it is UI design is very focused on visual aesthetic design. And you can see on the slide, it calls out some of those components. So people who are very strong and by the way, UI is user interface, UX is user experience. So some of the things you might be more focused on in UI design are fonts, layouts, color, spacing, branding, animation, and responsive design, which is when you create designs that work across multiple devices, tablets, phones, and desktops, something you have to think about when you're working at a scale of most companies nowadays, not just Capital One, but when you're making cross-device experiences. UX design, user experience design, is more focused on creating user-friendly and intuitive experiences. And some of the things you might do that are related to that are research and understanding customers' pain points, what are their needs. You might even document their full customer journey in a map, so you can point to each part of the experience and see the different touch points. And a lot of times it involves prototyping with customers to get a sense of what they're struggling with and how you could better your product. All of those kinds of things. And you can see other parts of it are called out here. In this visual, it's kind of assuming that UI is baked into UX, I think, which I wouldn't say necessarily, but there is that overlap. So it's hard to just like, cut it out of the picture. I think the last thing you were mentioning was the product development process. I think that maybe is just more of like a holistic thing. And a lot of times if you're applying for roles, you'll see product designer as the name of the role. And I think this visual is good at capturing that a product designer is expected to do both UI and UX, and it's a catch-all term for this thing. And it might include other things like after you launch your product, how can you make sure that people are still adopting it? There's a high level of retention, tracking those kind of metrics with your product manager. And those kind of things are how they are different and also how they're related. But I would also mention, just while we're talking about it, there are these niche specializations that might be interesting to some of you, and there are things that people just fully spend their time mastering. So within UX design, there are people who are dedicated to just research. At Capital One, for example, there are full-time dedicated researchers who kind of act as guides and consultants for best practices, and then me as a designer would take their advice and run tests and create prototypes. And there's a lot of different types of research formats you could undergo. Depending on what your needs are, it'll vary. You could have interviews with customers, you could send out surveys, you could create prototypes like I mentioned and actually test it with them and see if they struggle with any of the processes or any new needs arise. And then I'd also mention there are people who are content strategists or content designers, and they're focused specifically on what words and what copy are we using and how can we communicate best with our customers. So pretty diverse field with some niche specializations.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think we can pause from here and then turn to students for some Q&A.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, I'd also love to hear if anyone is like all set in on design, are they exploring it or where are they at?
Hi, I'm Catherine.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm really interested in user experience research, and I was just curious, like, can you go into a little bit more detail about how you collaborate on a typical like weekly basis with user researchers on your team or like the teams that you work with?
So at least for me, I don't collaborate necessarily on a weekly basis, but it kind of depends on the need. So sometimes there'll be projects like Offer Center, for example, is a project I worked on where we felt like we didn't understand exactly the mental models of customers, which is kind of just their assumptions of how our product works or what their needs are. And that's a little bit more exploratory. Rather than putting a prototype in front of them, we just wanted to know what their needs are and their expectations for experiences around offers. So in a situation like that, we would reach out to the research team and we'd have recurring meetings just to talk about how to create a plan for this. They'd guide us on creating a script and help us launch the test. And we use something called user testing, where we can launch these, and maybe you're familiar, but we can launch these videos and get the recordings back. And then we would handle the synthesizing, but it's of course after the researchers have kind of trained us on how to do that. And then I think there's a different type of research that we often do, which is, okay, we know what the problem is, we have a sense of these people's needs, and we're going to create a prototype for a feature. And that's a usability test or maybe a concept test. And in that case, it's a little bit different, but very similarly, we'd reach out to the research team. They'd help us formalize our plan and then revise our script, check our prototype just to make sure it's working. And oftentimes also something that we do at Capital One is hide our branding, just so we can get kind of objective feedback from customers without their perceptions being trained to the branding that they could recognize. And once you check all those boxes, launch a test, similarly do synthesis and use those insights to inform how you might change the product. So I don't necessarily meet with them on a weekly basis, but we reach out to them depending on our needs and they work very closely with us. Yeah, no problem. Hey.
I'm Jane. I'm currently a sophomore, so I haven't declared my major yet.
Uh-huh.
So I'm like debating between the computation media, which is CS and VMS that you did, or just VMS as a major. So I just want to ask you, like, were classes that you took for CS aren't helpful to your UI UX skills and like job requirements and stuff in terms of like different language or knowledge that you learned from CS classes?
So yeah, is there now a defined?
Yeah, it's a major now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. When I did it, it wasn't a major. So can you choose what classes you take in each major?
Yeah.
Still? Okay.
It's like few courses from both CS and VMS, and now it's like a major like called computation.
Okay, cool. And your question is more about like the CS part help you as a designer?
So like I'm debating between should I just major in VMS or would it be helpful if I and like what were some of the benefits that you got from taking CS?
If you want to do design, I think it's possible to just do VMS, but it might depend also on two things. One is, are you interested in learning about computer science? Because you don't necessarily have to take the courses, especially because designers don't have to code. That used to, it's kind of a debate. It used to be a debate, like, do designers have to know how to code? I don't really think so, but I would say it does help a lot in a sense, because it gives you a sense of what your engineering partners who you'll work with all the time are dealing with, or what they're thinking through and the constraints that you might face. And when you give them concepts, it might give you the language to speak with them, or a sense of feasibility about like this idea is just not going to be built in this time, or like what is an API, or what are these little things that they're talking about. So if you're interested, I think it's helpful, definitely, but it's not a requirement necessarily. Yeah. I would also mention too, when I did the IDM, I didn't take the higher level algorithm course, which I know is it's a little bit of an obstacle for some students, and it wouldn't have been as relevant either. So I took courses that I felt were very interesting, but also met the requirement. So you could still do that and have a balance of learning about computer science, but not necessarily like things that wouldn't be applicable to you.
What specific classes for CS that you thought was kind of helpful for?
I didn't take this class, but I knew a lot of students who took this elective for front-end development. I don't know if that's still a course, and I don't know the formal name of it, but that would give you a lot of just know-how about working with designers, I think, in a sense, and how front-end development functions. Beyond that, I think just the 201 data structures and algorithms gives you a sense of just how computer science works in general. And I studied abroad my junior year, so I took a class in computer graphics, which it's kind of at that intersection. And it was very interesting. It's not necessarily design, but it's about animation. So I enjoyed it. Not, I guess, something you can count on taking because it was abroad, but if you happen to find those elective courses and study at a different school for a little bit, that could be helpful too. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Irma, and
Hey.
I was wondering, within your rotational program, did you already, I know it's like a design rotational program, but like, did you already know that you're like wanting to focus on UI UX, or did they also kind of let you test out UX research, or was it like, was that, I don't know, I was just curious on that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. There are some of the other friends of mine in the same program were interested in research. So they had the opportunity to specialize in research and then find out that's what they want to do and kind of go down that path. At least for me, I knew I didn't want to do research as a specialization. But there is some leeway to find those roles. Generally speaking, most of them are UI UX oriented or strategy or those kind of things. A few of them are research focused. Yeah. Are you interested in research?
I think so, but also in the design, so that's why,
Okay.
yeah, kind of both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you could have that flexibility.
Kind of a follow-up on that question. If I know that I just want to do research, is it possible to go straight from undergrad to a UX research job, or is it more viable to go into something broader like UX design?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wouldn't say this is a definitive answer because I didn't take that path. But there are some roles I've seen that you could be a junior UX researcher in. And even in something like this, in the DDP's case, you could join and just do research and just keep doing research. When I was applying to jobs 3 years ago, it felt like there were more and more design opportunities, but there still weren't that many. I imagine now there's probably more, but it could feel similar. So if that's still the case, it might be a good way to get your foot in the door by doing UX design and then trying to find a way to pivot into research. Because oftentimes companies will have dedicated research teams within themselves internally. Yeah.
So I have a slightly different type of question. So I'm more into like software engineering stuff. And my question to you would be like, I guess I like to build out like cool like personal projects or whatever.
Yeah.
I must say I'm not the most artsy.
Yeah.
So I guess in your opinion, like if you were building something out and you wanted like a decent UI, how do you do it for like if you didn't have all of your like experience with Figma and everything? How do you put something good together?
Yeah. So from a developer's perspective, this one thing is you could also ask other people in this room too, like other designers if they have a take, but I wouldn't say also that you necessarily have to be artsy to have a good sense of just design, and it's something you could also lean into. I know from the little bit of dev that I did back in the day, there are things like if you're doing web development, Bootstrap, I don't know if you played around with Bootstrap at all, but it kind of already sets up like a good structure for visual design and layout and things like that. So there's probably some good tools or plugins that help you help make those decisions for you in some sense. But other than that,
what if you kind of wanted to go beyond that? Because like I guess like with Bootstrap or like there's like other like common libraries like Material UI for React or whatever.
right,
But it kind of looks a bit generic, right?
right.
So let's say you wanted to build something that looked kind of more, I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, it makes sense. I feel like there are some interesting things too that I've seen that are like low code or no code tools. I don't know if you've seen these. And they probably would be very easy for you, but they're almost designed to make it much easier to make visual design changes. So that could be something to explore. But I also have a part where I could just talk about resources, I think, that might be helpful. Because there's a lot of really good resources already out there, especially from the big tech companies that just document how to think about design or visual design. And I think one thing a lot of designers do anyways is like look around, just get visual inspiration, like take it, copy it, use it as a mood board, and kind of make your version of that. So that could be something you could do as well for your personal projects. But I think with time, you'll get better with it anyways. Yeah. Hopefully that was helpful. I don't know.
Okay, if no more question, we can get back to the question list.
Sure.
Yeah, so now we can dive more into your work at Capital One. Like, what do you like the most, and what is the most challenging part of your work?
Sure. So the thing I like the most about what I do, and it's probably related to developers' perspectives, some of them too, it's just I like the fact that I get to be a creative and just be a maker, and I have that as a profession. Like I can point to something as an output and say I'm making something that millions of people are using, even if not millions, like someone's using this thing. And it's pretty cool to know that it's out there and helping people in some way. And I can see like on my friend's phone, like, oh, like that's me, like as I was right there, I made that. So I love that. And then the challenging part, I would say, recently something that I've talked about with some of my managers, or a manager and a director on my team, and I found this to be true now about 3.5 years in, is the what of what you do as a designer becomes much easier. So when you get enough reps in, it's much easier to create mobile designs or some concept or prototype that someone needs. And it gets easier to synthesize research, and you can get better at recognizing some of these patterns and just creating ideas. It's really hard sometimes to figure out the how of what we do, which is how do you convince your product managers and your software engineer partners that we should go work on this thing, or this is the strategy that we should take, or this is what the vision for our product should be. And a lot of words you'll maybe hear are like influence and alignment. Like those are the big buzzwords in a professional sense, but those are really hard to do sometimes, and just convincing people and telling a story that brings people along to make the thing that you think is the right answer to the case, or finding the right answer to the case. I think that's the challenging part. It's also fun too, but it's challenging.
Gotcha. Now related to the portfolio question, do you actually need to create a portfolio or personal website to display your work in your job? Or?
Yeah, I would say you should absolutely create a portfolio. I think as a junior designer, especially coming out of school, and if some of you may have already looked at a lot of portfolios online, some of them are amazing, and they don't have to be incredibly comprehensive or interactive, especially if you're applying for internships. But having some online presence that you can easily link to, because most applications will ask you to link your portfolio, I would highly recommend it. And I'd also say, like, when I was applying to internships and jobs, we're competing with people who went to design schools, and they could like fall back on like taking a class that makes them make a portfolio or like gives them a case study project to work on. So you want to set yourself up for success in that way by having that presence, and maybe you don't need like a lot of projects, but having a couple of projects on there would help. And I don't know if I have a slide on this. I don't think I do. No, I don't. But I would say there's some alternatives too. If you don't make a fully interactive site, sometimes all you need is a PDF of just explaining two of your projects. But if you were to make a site, there's a lot of great resources out there now. And I, for example, use Webflow, which is one of those low code tools that feels like you're programming. You're not really, but you're like choosing padding size and spacing and stuff like that. But it helps make you a really strong portfolio. Squarespace is another good resource. That's something I used originally for my first one. And Framer is something I've heard about recently too. Something that lets you prototype or create a design that kind of translates to code pretty easily. There's a lot of great things out there. I could name like a bunch too, that like GitHub hosts websites, and I know people have used Weebly. There's a million things you could use. I'd definitely recommend making something.
There's a lot of resources, and sort of related on that, like you mentioned the new tools coming out. Like what are some other trends that you're seeing that you feel like, are there certain skills you think the students should like be developing right now?
So I wouldn't say this is a trend. It kind of was growing in popularity in terms of awareness in the last few years, but it's a requirement now, and it really helps you stand out, is accessible design. I don't know if this is something y'all have heard of. It seems like some nods, so maybe. It's really important for companies to create products that are inclusive of all types of people, regardless of their ability. And in a practical sense, what that means at Capital One, for example, when we approve our designs, we have to make sure they pass certain tests, like color contrast tests. Can your text be viewed on this color for low vision users or colorblind users? Do your images have clear labels that someone who's using a screen reader could make sense of? And even hierarchy and layout, these are things that help if you're doing it in an intentional way for accessibility reasons. And especially for web design, if that's something you look into, or web development, there's the WCAG guidelines, or the G is guidelines, but they have a lot of documentation out there about how to make your experience inclusive. And I would also say, if you're interested in looking into that, there's a lot of good resources. Microsoft in particular, I think, has a really good documentation around inclusive design and what goes into that and just the thinking behind it. So that's one thing. Another thing I'd mention, and this is something that everyone talks about all the time now, but AI, it's playing a role already in design and really cool ways. And I would be aware and stay on top of it. Not that you need to know how to use all the tools because it's still being actively worked on, but just aware of the capabilities. Because some of the things I've seen, for example, so Figma, also if you're not familiar with Figma, I would also mention that. you should get familiar with Figma. It's generally the software you would use in most design roles for creating mockups, for prototyping, and so on. And they host a conference every year. I went to it this past year. So they were demoing some AI tools. And it's really interesting to see what's already possible. And some of you have probably played with similar tools where you can generate images or icons with text prompts. They're already working on assistants that can kind of create, if you have a design system and you can plug in certain types of colors and type, it can create mockups in an instant. If you just say like, create an onboarding flow for an app for someone who wants to walk dogs or find people who can walk your dog, right? There are prompt generated experiences that can be built that way, and they will probably be built that way. So then there's a larger question of like, how does that affect the job? And I don't know for a fact, but there are that's why I think you should be aware of it, because it will impact the job in some way, but there are some schools of thought around it. For example, if an AI tool could generate designs, at least basic designs in some manner, one school of thought is that designers will shift from, quote unquote, pixel pushing to zooming out. in thinking more often about strategy, the full customer journey, user flows, and solving those bigger problems when they can rely on these tools to solve some of those smaller problems. And oftentimes, if you work at a larger company, they have a defined design system. Like their buttons are all going to look one way. Their screens are all going to have the same type of colors and types. So there's not a lot of parameters you can shift there. So you can imagine how that's almost programmable, right? And the second thing is if these tools become commonplace, you might work with engineers or product managers who will also use the same tools, and they might start designing with you. So something to be aware of. Don't know where it's all going, but I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of like tools and like AI tools, like in general. Do you have any resources to recommend to students?
Yeah, I do have a slide about it's not working.
That's yeah.
Oh, and this is something I was mentioning earlier about just like different terms used. These are just different screenshots from various companies like Capital One or Microsoft or IBM. And, presumably a lot of them are hiring for roles that do very similar things, but you'll see completely different names like product designer, user experience designer, and reading the actual job descriptions will definitely give you a better sense of what they're looking for, but just know there's like a little bit of variability and it's not very clear cut sometimes. Let's see. Okay, actually, I guess not. I don't think I have it on this side, but I think the coolest tool that I've seen, there's a startup called, I think it's called Diagram, acquired by Figma. And they demoed a lot of tools at this conference, different tools that automate or generate designs. I would definitely explore that and just see the type of work that they were doing. Beyond that, there's another tool called Wizard, but it's spelled UIZARD. It's very similar, different team, but it has a lot of that generative design capability that I think you guys should play around with.
Thank you so much for sharing. And the last question is just any final thoughts or advice, and then we can open up to Q&A.
Yeah. I don't want to, maybe I'll just leave this up here and maybe this is something that we could share out too. There's a lot of really great resources out there. In terms of just like final thoughts or advice, I would just highly encourage you all, if you're interested in it, and even if you're interested in anything else that's not design, to just try networking as much as you can, even if it feels awkward, just cold messaging someone on LinkedIn, especially if they are alums. I've found a lot of people actually take the time to talk to me that they have no idea who I am, but for some reason they're very kind and they're happy to talk for 15 or 30 minutes. Really great way just to hear what the job is like before actually trying it. And oftentimes people will take the time to help you, refer you, tell you about the role, about the company. So I know I felt a lot of imposter syndrome because I didn't have a design degree, and you compete with a lot of people who do. I think after you get enough time in, if you find this is the thing you like, then that just goes away. So I guess those two things, and then there's a lot of resources that I could share. So yeah.
There is another final question in the last 5 minutes.
So earlier you said that product management can kind of be part of your job. So I'm just curious to hear, like, what's the typical career trajectory of a UI UX designer? Do you transition to be a product manager, or like you just become more senior UI UX designer? Like, how does it usually work?
It's a really good question. I would say it definitely varies. I've seen people be UX researchers or product designers and then do product management. Or I've also I work with people actually who were product managers and then became designers, because there are different parts of the job that just attract them. And they only learn that when they try it out. So I don't know if there's a typical one, but there's potential for movement between the two. And I'd also say if you choose design, oftentimes if you just keep going that route, you'd end up as a creative director or VP of design maybe. But before even getting there, there's this path that designers have to, it's like a fork in the road that you almost have, whereas you could choose to keep being an individual contributor or IC. And that's like the terminology companies will use, where it just means you're still practicing making the designs and working in Figma and doing those things. Or you choose to be a people manager. And sometimes companies will have very clear routes where you have to choose a path and you're more focused on building teams and helping and mentoring people. But some companies also have matured enough and created space where you can kind of do a little bit of both. So that's a different kind of decision, but that's something that designers will have to often choose. Yeah.
So I have a question about Capital One specifically, because I've also coincidentally heard another Duke student who is now an alum say that it's a great company to work for.
Mhm.
So what like particular aspects of the culture do you feel like makes it a good company to work?
There are a few things. I think one, they do a really good job of just finding nice people that you want to work with. And I think that goes a long way. Especially if you have experiences where you worked with other people that aren't in that group, but very kind people, very collaborative, willing to help you. And especially if you join as an early career individual, willing to take the time to talk to you about what they do and just teach you. So really great people. I think there's a good sense of work-life balance, very healthy respect of your time as an individual, which different companies will clearly lay out for you they either do or don't do. And if it's something that resonates with you and you like having a job where you can stretch yourself but still have your time protected to live a life outside of work, I think it's a great place to be. For design in particular, it's a very mature design organization. It's grown a lot in the last years. There's a lot of designers in it, and there's really good leadership. So I think all of those things kind of are really good from my perspective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, please join me in thanking Vignesh for talking.
Thank you.
Thank you.